Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams come true!
Hello, and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Except for today, when we're going to be talking about a TV show. I'm Krispy, my pronouns are she, they, and I make the comic Ghost Junk Sickness.
And I'm Thane, my pronouns are also she, they, and I make the comics Geralt and Witchwood. So this episode is going to be a bit different for obvious reasons. Krispy and I just happened to watch Voltron, and now we desperately want to talk about it. So this is our supervillain origin story. I mean, this episode's origin story.
So strap in. Tonight, Screen Tones is going to be talking about Voltron. We're going to be doing our best to make this comprehensive to listeners who's never seen the show, but we'll see what we could do.
So Voltron Legendary Defender is the 2016 remake of the Voltron cartoon that ran from 1984 to 1985. It's a science fiction story about 5 random humans who become the Paladins of Voltron, a legendary alien weapon that consists of 5 robot lions that join together to become one huge mecha soldier that wrecks everyone's shop.
It's a pretty fun starting premise, and the animation and production in the show is consistently great. But the story starts to get rather shaky, and it becomes increasingly difficult to pin down any of the characters' respective arcs, personalities, or goals beyond their surface archetypes.
So why is that? What happened? And what can we learn from it? We're going to go into it in order from the most obvious and straightforward problems to the more complicated ones, which means that we're starting with world building.
Oh boy.
World building.
Voltron had a really unique way of promising and holding out for this potential that it could have been. And, like the premise of it, like we just said, was really, really cool with, having these destined humans piloting these lions that turned into a giant mecha. Like that sounds absolutely cool. And it could have been this absolute marvelous story. And one of the things that are, I guess, one of the biggest things that it was constantly missed was the proper payoff and exposition of it all. So, when watching the show, you were constantly kind of faced with confusion as to where exactly we're going, what terms meant, and so on and so forth with that.
There are some things that they set up like pretty decently early on. Like there's kind of a few major factions that you keep track of. Like Earth is sort of like a backwater. So the human characters come from there. We all know humans. You don't need to exposit too much about that. But there's sort of 2 big important parties in space. There's the Galra Empire, which are kind of the bad guys. They're like taking over all these planets and subjugating the populations that already lived there. And then there's sort of ancient like alternate side, which is the Alteans. They're sort of the good guys, but they kind of mostly died off like thousands of years before the story started, except for 2 of them who they kind of were the ones who built the Alteans were the ones who built the giant Voltron mecha soldier and created all the technology that the characters use. And so the Galrans and the Alteans are sort of like any important tech in the story was probably either made by one or by the other. And they kind of keep track of that. That's one of the things that the writers definitely considered very important throughout the story. Sometimes to kind of the detriment, because after a certain point in 8 seasons of a show, you kind of start to hope that things might be a little bit more complex when you're talking about an entire galaxy's worth of like factions and stuff, and you go to all these different planets. But really, all the important conflict is just down to, is it Galra or is it Altea?
Yeah. And I think like that back and forth was something that was just really excruciating when you're having something that is so long-winded as 8 seasons can be. So when you have this plot that kind of surrounds basically two concepts that are very much said over and over again, but never extrapolated upon, it becomes a little predictable in that sense and very, very shallow, very, very fast. Something else that usually is described in the show, usually, I mean, always, is the I don't even know what to call it, but it is called quintessence, which is everything and yet nothing at the same time. Throughout the show, they'll have this supernatural, possibly soul-like essence stuff that the show really, really relied on, basically more as like a scapegoat or a MacGuffin or anything else. It was so many multitude of things that it was kind of hard to keep track of what it actually was. And so when you have a story that kind of relies on this one word being extremely ambiguous, you lose that impact when the scenes kind of rely on it, build up to it. And this kind of relates to when you have people reading or watching, have an audience fairly really invested in your work. It becomes kind of a letdown when you're kind of like following along the plot, but you're not understanding the plot. And so it's not a fun surprise when it gets to something surprising, because the surprise feels shallow, because it's just, oh, it's quintessence again.
Huge shock. Yeah, it literally was everything, because in every episode, like, if the writers needed like something to get the characters into a problem, or something to get them out of a problem, or
Mhm.
something that they want, or something that the enemies want, the answer was always quintessence pretty much every single time. So it it changed form and function depending on what it needed to do, and this meant that it lost any kind of like internal consistency, because like
Yes.
it's just space magic, like, but they don't want to call it that because they got to keep the sci-fi flavor. And yeah, it just kind of became this like kind of nothing. It's there.
I think it's just this problem you run into when you haven't grounded an idea. And that's exactly what it is, where the idea wasn't actually fully realized. And I don't feel like anybody agreed on exactly where and why and who and when it came from. And they were
Yeah.
just like, oh, no, this is the space magic. Oh, don't say that, guys. It's the thing. But, the plots and the episodes that relied on revealing that it was all along quintessence, um, were really, really hard to stomach and really, really hard to enjoy, because it becomes extremely predictable and a bit of a letdown in those moments.
Well, when you have a plot device that can be anything, and like this does happen at many points in the story, like the characters will be in like a tight scrape or something, and then it'll turn out that like quintessence has some attribute that can help them out of it. It's like, well, okay, you could just write anything there.
Yeah.
Now they're not in the problem anymore.
And
So
this is where their world building really, really falls absolutely flat, where that exposition that's needed to kind of ground an idea so that the audience understands it, so that they have the tools to actually care about the concept of the world that you're supposed to be exploring. It doesn't happen.
oh, there's just some really fun moments when the audience kind of understands like what the world building concepts mean, and then you can kind of plant something without explaining it, and just seeing that will spark that immediate like,
Yes.
oh no, in the person watching, that you can kind of explore later. But yeah, you need to do a bit of groundwork and have like consistency in your ideas so that they become recognizable before they're explained.
Yes, yes, it's exactly that. And that is excellent writing. And it's an idea, or it's not so much an idea. It's a topic that's usually discussed in the writer community about, like, if someone starts to predict my plot, am I a bad writer? I become self-conscious, or is this good writing? And to me personally, it's good writing when they understand where the point of all of this is going, where they're like, "Oh, I understand the concepts that you've laid down, and this is making me invested. I can understand what the characters' motives are from there. And then, it also kind of comes into you speculating and having all of these like headcanons or like ideas with like, oh, if they said that quintessence was this, what does it mean for that? And I remember when I was first starting watching Voltron, I was like, okay. I've not read anything about it. I missed the train completely. And I was just like, okay, I've heard enough about the show. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna watch it and clean slate. I don't know anything that's gonna happen. And I in the beginning was very much like, oh, okay, here's this concept. And I guess it might mean this or something like
This
that.
could be cool later on.
Yeah. Oh, I had so many of those moments.
I have faith that the writers are going somewhere cool with this. They wouldn't make a bad show.
And anyway, 8 seasons later, I had nothing to kind of get ramped up for because everything became, like I said, predictable or just kind of tedious in a sense where you're just like, I don't even know what the point of this word is, but
Mm.
they make it sound like it's important.
Oh
I still
boy,
don't
oh
know
boy.
why.
Okay, so I have an example of the kind of thing that like solid world building can kind of do in a show when it's like really paid attention to, and it's in Avatar: The Last Airbender. The concept of bending is
Yes.
so well established that you can have an episode where the characters go to like some new town, new place, and there's something that the locals are all doing that they fully believe is like supernatural in some way, but the knowledge that the audience already has of the world building kind of gives you the tools to start being like, but wait, it might not be that. Like it could actually be bending related or
Hmm.
like spirit related. And often like you can kind of start to analyze like what's going on, and the little bit of a mystery, it gives you like the clues that you need. And I feel like that's kind of where world building, like really solid world building, can be a lot of fun, is when you almost kind of treat it like a little mystery. Like you present something and then the reader or the viewer or whatever can kind of think about what's already been planted in the past and use those to put together what's happening in the present. And it feels
Hmm.
very satisfying when you kind of are given that ability by the writers. The second thing that going back to the Voltron thing, um, something that they did in the show, which I think was an attempt to kind of make it feel like the characters have really been thrust into this alien society and like we're not on Earth anymore, everything is different, is they planted alternate names for time and distance measurements. Which are like all these like, oh, but a second is a tick, and like a something is a dobosh, and like it's weeps or whatever. And it's a cute idea. Like a lot of shows do this, except that in practice, they just kind of were like, oh yeah, by the way, in this world, everybody calls it these things, and then they never really thought further on that. So every single alien planet uses the exact same terms, regardless of how much contact they have with, like, are these Galran words because the Galrans are an empire, so all the planets that they've occupied use them. But then, if that's the case, why do the Alteans, who've been like in stasis for 10,000 years, also use these words?
Hmm.
Are they Altean words? And the
Hmm.
Galrans just decided to use them because it was convenient. But then, why do all the backwater planets also use it? And then also, why do the human paladins who grew up on Earth, where we definitely don't use those words, why do they immediately switch to start using these like instantly without question? Like by episode 2, they've like just gotten into space and now they're already like there's a few one-off little jokes where they're like comparing like what's the length of a tick to the length of a second, and like, oh, one's a little shorter, which is cute, but you kind of need to do a little more than that. Like maybe they
Hmm.
forget to use that word occasionally, and then it confuses the aliens that they're talking to or something like that.
Hmm.
When they just immediately understand something that quickly, it stops feeling like a real cultural or world building concept, and it just starts feeling like a writing convenience or an in
Yes.
joke.
Yeah. It's when they kind of like take this terminology and they constantly like put it into your face without kind of like an application to it. It's kind of like if we were to watch The Last Airbender and they're like bending this, bending that, bending this, but you never see them bend. So you're just like, is this like a move? I don't know. We don't see them bend. We don't see the correlation from with the term and the context. So the context is lost. And in Voltron's case, with the constant repeating of it, they did explain it like a little bit, but they still didn't over explain it, or not over explain it, but give it enough context for it to be a tool to use for the universe. It just became like Thane said, like almost like an inside joke. It was weird. I felt like an outsider watching a show that I shouldn't have.
You'd think after like 7 seasons, some of these things would start to have been like, oh, we found out the history of why they call it that.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, no.
And there's so much that exposition does to a story to lend to getting immersed into caring about it too, but also aiding, like, the characters and stuff like that, and how they're kind of building towards that. uh Oh my gosh, there's definitely a lot of beats missed. But with that, I kind of wanted to kind of segue into talking about like more of the plot structure, kind of faux pas.
The plot structure quirks.
Quirks, yes.
The quirks.
We should make up our own word in celebration of Voltron.
Plonks.
The quonks.
The plonks and the quonks.
The plonks and the quonks. So about the plot structure quonks is that, they have they have a lot of definitely beats that are missed because of the fact that, there wasn't that payoff or build up to having the plot kind of mean or even land on a lot of stuff. So a lot of things felt extremely formulaic, and rehashing a lot of the same ideas, and also to the point where you're losing characters in the whole midst of it while still not getting anything from that. And it's really interesting because I had stated before that there was a lot of promise to what this could be, but it's definitely shown that when you don't have something fully planned or you don't commit to the bit, it definitely easily falls apart, and it starts to really, really fall flat with that. And so I think of when writing like an epic story that is to span as big as it did, um definitely plan out those beats and to understand the goals and the point of each episode or arc or whatever you have. Because one of the things that was really, really kind of hard to follow on Voltron was points, and I didn't know what the themes were.
Burn.
But I mean, I didn't know what I was supposed to learn at the end of each episode. Not like, oh, we're gonna learn a lesson as a family here. It's not so much that, but I need some advancing towards a goal or something. And I just felt like I was sitting in a bog, hanging out with my frogs, learning nothing. I don't know.
On some level, Voltron is kind of the premise of the show is perfectly positioned to have a big, like, capital T theme about like friendship and the
Yes.
power of bonds, because the literal premise of the show is how the characters, through the vessels of these mechanical lions that they pilot, can come together and become something that is stronger than the sum of its parts, which is the big thing, the big Voltron thing. There's a lot of like there's some rich territory in there for like getting the characters to bond with each other. Although we have decided to set the character arcs as the final category in this episode because it is going to get complicated. When it comes to the actual plot structures, there are some like scene to scene and like beat to beat issues that it had, mostly which centered around repetition and strict adherence to formula. There was it started to feel at a certain point like the show had a set of reveals that they were building their episodes to reveal things, from like a top-down approach. Like somebody sat down and was like, here's the episode, we're going to show that this is a thing, or like this is a thing, we have a cool new ship and they're going to see it, and that's the big reveal of the episode, rather than kind of thinking it through from the inside out, from the perspective of the characters who are living in this world. And there was like a beat sheet of exactly how to get from point A to point B. So there were a lot of scenes that kind of went through the same pattern of highs and lows.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also a lot of reveals that were very similar. Some favorites were, shock, it's Galra technology, or it's a Galra, or surprise, it's Altean thing. Surprise, it's a big explosion that interrupts them. Or it's a very, very, very big ship. And as for the actual scene structure, it got very predictable, because there were two major problems, one of which was that the audience, it was very hard to feel any kind of suspense, primarily because you kind of knew after a certain point that the characters were never going to actually fail to do whatever it was they were trying to do.
Yeah.
And in the moment, you could kind of sense the exact second that they were about to like figure out the thing, because they would always do it in the same way. They would be having a big problem and everybody would be panicking and flailing around in the cockpit, and then someone standing off to the side of the group, there would be a close-up of their face looking concerned, and then suddenly their expression will shift very subtly, and they'll look up with a little like and then they'll say, oh, but maybe if we did this, and then they'll name some like, oh, what if we turned around the screws in the particle accelerator cannons or something. And then another character will be like, that's never been done before, it's impossible. And then they'll be like, but it's our only chance, we've got to try. And then there'll be a few shots of various characters straining at controls or moving things around. They'll be pushing on things and pulling on things, and then they'll do it. It'll be fine. They saved the day. Success!
Always.
Hooray!
It's definitely the complete lack of stakes almost. It's just like, I want to see some consequences of things not working out for once. I don't want to see them say, oh my goodness, that's never been done before, and then they do it in the first try, and that happens a lot. Oh my gosh.
Golly, every time. It's a little bit of a tricky one to like kind of come at from a webcomic perspective. It might not strictly apply, because to make the volume of episodes that they have like as a webcomic artist is pretty prohibitive.
Yeah.
Gosh, a lot of episodes. But I mean, it's still something to kind of keep in mind, like just repeating the same like structure of a scene. Like sometimes you got to vary it up. Sometimes you got to let your characters fail to do the thing that they're trying to do and explore the consequences of that.
Yeah, because like with that helps them grow from a decision that didn't work out, so that they're like, oh, I have to look at something at a different angle. And that was just never provided to them. I mean, I can't say never. There was obviously moments where characters pieced out, I will say, and they might have thought of this pieced out character maybe once, and thinking about it's just that process. It's just that process of the plot reacting to having something happen, and the reaction just never was there. It was just like, oh, okay, something's happening, we're gonna do the thing, and they do the thing, and that's it. That's a chicken salad seeds a wrap. It was just
it's almost a wrap. Then they've got to have some banter where they make some
yes.
jokes at each other, and then cut one another off to make a better joke and one up one another, and then they get interrupted by an explosion.
Really?
Just to, get ready for the next episode.
Is this the power of friendship? Like, it's interesting we talk about something like that where the plot, I think the theme maybe, with the fact that they have the lions that go together to make a giant robot because of teamwork. You think if the theme was teamwork,
You would
Um,
think, wouldn't you?
I didn't see much
You
of
would
that.
think.
And I think that it's a great lesson, um, watching it and being like, "Okay, I can see what they're trying to do. I can see that you're trying to relate this to something about the power of friendship and the power of working together, the power of heart. And it's just not landing because there's just no committing to the actual like consequences of not having that work out and them having to work together to find that and to figure it out. Like Thane said, it was just there wasn't a lot of struggle with a consequence or an action or anything like that. It was just like if something was rather big and kind of foreboding that the cast had to face, it was just like, oh, this is kind of hard to write, and we have to wrap it up in about, I don't know, 5 minutes. Let's put some quintessence in there and let's call it a day. And I can understand as a writer, when doing something this big, you're just like, okay, I have these episodes, I have these chapters, for webcomic, and my goal is X, and I need to get to XYZ or whatever like that. And I understand being written into a corner. I think we've all done that. We've all had moments where we're just like, okay, I got to step back. But I don't know. This relying on something constantly really does feel repetitive, and it's nothing surprising. It doesn't bring anything new to the table, and again, the characters suffer from that, like extremely so, when there's nothing to grow from.
I feel like so it's kind of interesting because there are a lot of very fast-paced and intense action sequences. And I feel there's a sense that there was some goal to have the characters grow and bond through these action sequences. But the trouble with that approach is that the entire time that they were in those moments, it was just crisis mode. So they would be helping
Yes.
each other with like, this is life or death. We have to move the thing. We have to get out of the way of the laser beams or whatever. Um, but those aren't really like not dying is like it's not really as character building as a lot of writers kind of hope it is, I suppose. Like
Yeah.
it's about how they work together, and these moments can definitely help to like forge a tighter friendship and sense of bonding between the team.
Mhm.
But you have to lay the groundwork for the nature of those bonds outside of the actual combat in the downtime sequences. And those were never really taken advantage of for those purposes. Like when they were not actively in combat, the main setting of interaction that the characters had with one another was like solving little practical problems or just like cracking jokes.
Mhm.
And one thing that bothered me as I was watching the show was that none of the characters ever laughed at each other's jokes. Like
No.
they would have scenes where like character one would like make a wisecrack about what was happening, and then another character would make like a different wisecrack that was kind of had like a mean-spirited
Mhm.
mocking tone towards the first character. And then it was like the joke of the scene was that like neither character's joke was funny. But
Mhm.
at a certain point when these characters have been spending so much time with each other, you kind of want them to take joy in
Yeah.
each other's like laugh at each other's jokes just once. Come on, guys. You're supposed
Please
to
be
be a team.
nice. And
Just
and
like the bare minimum, just crack a smile. I'm
it just
begging you.
becomes unbearable to watch when characters are so mean that way, and it's just constantly like they don't want to be here and neither do I don't know.
I've watched all kinds of things where the characters are mean or sassy or like they have a dynamic that just kind of is that way. And like it's fine, but the tone has to set up that expectation so that it
Mhm.
feels in keeping with the story.
Mhm.
And in this show, it constantly felt like they wanted it to be on the surface about like friendship and bonding, but all that was kind of there below the surface was like high octane action sequences and then like look how dumb they are.
Yeah. Yeah. It was definitely a lot of action after action after action, and not a lot of reaction. And when we did have downtime, like you said, it was just wisecracks and kind of berating each other and putting each other down. And I don't know, that's a really weird stance to take on something, again, I think is supposed to be about friendship. I'm not
There
sure.
are some indications. I've watched some other analyses of the series, and some of them go into like interviews with the production teams and stuff. And there is some indication that some of the showrunners really wanted to go in a darker direction than what the
Oh.
initial pitch for the show was supposed to be, which was very like it's based on a toy line and it's for like a young audience, so it's got to stay fairly light, and like the especially the younger main characters can't like really get seriously hurt or anything, so we're
Mhm.
just going to keep this in kind of a fun episodic format. And the early seasons kind of bear this up because they do kind of have a bit of a monster of the week feel, which is a lot of fun. They
It
actually are
is.
the strongest seasons. And then later on, I guess there was a little bit more freedom allowed for the show, maybe as it got more popular or something. But at the same time, like budgets were getting cut and like schedules were getting screwed with. But there was a pervasive goal to head in more of a the horrors of war kind of
Mhm.
direction, and to
Mhm.
make things ambiguous and like get a little bit less black and white, like it's just the good Voltron paladins and Alteans versus the big evil Galrans. There is a moment in the second season where they, or is it in the anyway, there's a moment where the initial big bad guy, like the leader of the Galran Empire, who literally just looks like a big evil guy, gets killed in the middle of a season. And after that, the primary villain is his son, who has more of a sort of like an anime bishonen kind of look, like long silver hair and all that. And he has a bit of a connection, like he has more of a connection to the Altean side of things, and starts seeming to be trying to build like more bridges and stuff, but still has kind of like a darker side. So the idea there is like we're going in more of a gray morality kind
Mhm.
of direction. But for whatever reason, things didn't quite gel in that direction either. They just kind of ended up with like a little of one and a little of the other, but not enough to coalesce into something stronger than the sum of its parts, one might
Yeah.
say.
It's definitely like a nice little lesson of like, again, not committing to some kind of narrative when you see stuff like that, because it has really fun like setups. You're just like, oh, okay,
Mm.
the evil witch lady, can't remember her name, uh is gonna have some kind of really cool like plot to this at one point in one of the seasons, or evil guy's son, oh, okay, we're gonna see like, we're gonna have this character which is going to have another side to this other character's, side. It's gonna expand more, it's gonna be good. Expectations are up. It's gonna we're gonna know what quintessence is, maybe, like, so much hope.
Oh, mitigate those expectations.
And then they were like, nah, we're not going that way. That's silly.
Well, they
That's
kind of were, but it just, I don't know. It's hard to, yeah.
it's hard to pin down. The only thing that I can say is that it didn't feel committed to it, because if you committed to something that had that like more gray kind of morality, and not really having more nuance to some of the things, or having the darker tones, that you had to take risks when you do stuff like that, when you kind of deviate narratives, and you're kind of like, okay, I'm going to divert the expectations by jumping over this little doobie doo, and having some kind of expectation be thwarted. It's gonna be great. But then they were like, oh no, I'm kind of scared of that, let's close the door, it's drafty in here, I don't know, like it felt.
It is tough because on another level, like especially when talking about any kind of mainstream media show, it's not the work of like a single
Yes.
artist, and often like the people who are credited as writers or as showrunners, they don't have that much control over the overall like tone or direction of the story. So
Mhm.
there were almost definitely limitations to how far they could go with certain decisions that they made, which actually is probably a good lead into the characters section, because there is one sort of infamous moment in Voltron. Okay, so context for the story itself. It all kicks off when the five paladin human characters encounter alien technology on Earth, which is the lions. They end up bonding with the lions, and then they get found by the Alteans, Allura and Karan, who have like a magic castle that is a spaceship that like flies around in space. A bunch of stuff happens. They join up with her. This is sort of the inciting incident of the story. And the composition of the cast at this point is there are four kind of younger paladins, who were all kind of students in training or in school back on Earth. And then there's one older paladin named Shiro, who was like he was already kind of like a war hero. He had gone into space and been like captured by the Galrans, and then like came back, and all the other characters idolized him, and he sort of took up the mentor slot in the cast for a bunch of younger characters, alongside the two Altean characters who sort of they knew the ins and outs of the tech and could kind of introduce the human characters who were initially like fish out of water, to like, oh well, here's what's going on, here's how
Mhm.
all this works, like here's who the factions are, kind of the introduction to this wider world of outer space. And the classic way that these types of five-man bands tend to go when one of them is an older mentor character is that the first few seasons will go by with kind of the team functioning as a unit, and then very often the mentor character will die so that one of the younger cast, sort of the designated leader archetype, can like step up
Mhm.
and become the leader they were always destined to be. And I don't know if this has been like super concretely proven or if this is just like a rumor with a lot of credence behind it. But there is very strong evidence that Shiro was supposed to die at the end of season two, and that he would just remain not in the story. And one of the other characters, the one of the younger paladins, whose name is Keith, was going to step into the role of the leader, whose lion forms the head of the big robot Voltron. And this became a problem because as soon as the season actually started airing, the sort of the higher ups involved in production realized that Shiro was going to be the most popular character
Mhm.
and decided that he could not be dead. And not only could he not be dead, he couldn't even be dead for very like be off screen for very long. So they had to find a way to bring him back into the story when everything else was planned after that point. And this the way that they decided to handle this was that they wrote him back in, uh but like he just kind of took the place of another character
Yeah.
who had already been kind of drawn into the storyboards and like laid out in the episodes, and he would just repeat the lines that this other character was going to say.
Mhm.
And the effect that this had was pretty catastrophic when it comes to giving these characters personalities
Yeah.
or arcs that were consistent. Because I mean, for one thing, at the point where when Shiro returns and he kind of takes back his position as the leader of the team very quickly, and literally ousts another character who had stepped into that like piloting the head lion of the group. They had made a big fuss about needing to have all of them present. It's so important that every single paladin be present to form Voltron. And then when Shiro returns and that character leaves and they can still do it, it's like, oh, I guess that wasn't important after
Yeah.
all. Um, I guess they could just do it anyway. We didn't have to worry that much about it. And also, like, none of the other characters really get chances to react to these
Yeah.
things because they hadn't been written as reacting to them. Like those storyboards didn't exist because they hadn't had time to like make that was a last minute plot decision, but it was huge and
Mhm.
it had an enormous ripple effect on everything else in the show.
Yeah, it's such a floppy fish when it comes to kind of like characterizing a lot of these little characterizing the characters, and having something that was very individual to them. Oftentimes you'll see that what they'll do is that they'll have an episode, and it felt like this episode could technically be replaced with any of the characters. They were that kind of flat. And, this is a problem that, people can run in when they have larger casts and stuff like that, and they have to focus on other characters. But you'd think that a show that has, I mean, technically they are supposed to be five main characters because Voltron needs those five to make the Voltron. You'd have some sort of plan to kind of like really uh, elaborate and expand their beings, their whole them. And it doesn't go beyond what they've done. And I feel like that what you've just described, Thane, about the whole demise of Shiro was kind of like almost the beginning of the end so early, with that, because when you have something that interferes with the potential of them reacting, because how a character reacts to something is very personal to how the character is because of who they are.
Hmm.
Once you start doing that, and once you start losing who they are, it's just they're just going to become, I don't know, cardboard
Cutouts.
cutouts. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly that. That you can easily just place in whatever scene. And so nothing becomes individual, nothing becomes memorable, being like, oh my goodness, this episode of Keith was really Keith. And it's like, but who is Keith? What is Keith? That could have been an episode for Lance too. It just,
Hmm.
they can easily be replaced and mismatched in every kind of situation with this, which really
Yeah.
kills the character arcs that they never had.
They the Yeah, that I feel was kind of the big thing, is that each character has a sort of singular trait that is their thing. Like you have Shiro being like the mentor, and Keith is like he's broody and sort of leaderly but not really allowed to fully ascend into that role.
Mm-hmm.
And then like you have kind of the Joker member of the cast, and you have like the nice foodie and the technological geek one, and those are good starting points for characters. Like
Yeah.
it's a nice way to kind of conceptualize how are they different from the rest of their friends. But that's just a starting point. Like
Yes.
you have to develop beyond that. You have to show them growing, you have to show them like interacting, and you have to show how those interactions change as the things in the show affect them. And when every member of the cast completely shrugs off like the death or loss of one of their members, or like something else that you might show them looking sad about it for a minute, and then the beginning of the next episode kicks off with them acting like everything is totally normal.
Yeah.
It hurts the audience's ability to like believe in them as people.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely takes away that kind of like merit for who they are when they don't have a reaction that's genuine to their character. So, when you have something happen, especially when you kill off a character, it's a great moment to kind of show like, wow, okay, so this character dies. How did these characters feel about this death, and how do they deal with something so big? Because death is a huge thing, when in stories, because it changes so much, right? There's still a whole, depending on who they
Hmm.
are, but like Shiro's a pretty big character, so you'd think that some characters would have some really cool reflection and growth from this part. I mean, it doesn't help with the fact that he didn't stay dead for long, but in the same sense, it's just like this was a problem, is that I never felt like they grew from moments, or ever faced any real peril or any kind of consequences that would change them or even signal things that made them who they are. It was just, oh, okay. Sometimes they would actually have moments in the show where the tech one's personality can be interchanged with the one that was really really funny instead, and the way that they
Mm.
did it was just so weird and off-putting, because never had they ever established that the funny one had any kind of knowledge in this field. He just all of a sudden knew this whole thing, and it wasn't because he was observing the techie one, it was just because
Oh, they felt like giving him a moment in this episode, so
yeah.
he gets the moment. We have one opportunity for somebody to say something smart here, and we haven't given one to this guy yet, so
Yeah.
just give it to him.
Yeah, it 100% felt like that. And sometimes they'd have well, not sometimes. They had an episode where the characters got split, and again, that could have been absolutely wonderful. It could have been like, "Oh, okay, when you have casts that split that are usually together, this is a great moment to show some characterization, some growth, and some reactions. It's good. We're gonna learn something from here. They can reflect. What if like two characters were alone and they're just like, you know what? This is my thoughts on this other character, and you're like, whoa, I didn't know that you think that way, and that really helps drive, you caring for the character, and you thinking about the way they think, and so on and so forth. um but when it kind of just is this board of, you know well, let's just get the day over with and defeat the evil. This is specific to the show that it was set up to be, because obviously, like, these plots do exist in other kinds and forms of media where it doesn't have to be as deep as it is. But when the expectation is there that, these are characters that are so cool, I would like to see why and how.
Yeah. And in addition to that, I'd like to see a little bit under the surface, like get those scenes in where you find out something like a little bit surprising about the character. And not surprising as in like, did you know that my favorite food was actually like surprise, something different than what you thought? Like, because it felt like at a certain point they would have little moments where they would share dialogue like that. And it's like, okay, this is cute, but like give me a little bit more meat.
Yes.
And then the other thing is that those moments should build on one another, and the team's dynamic when they're all like fighting or hanging out together or like saving the world or whatever in season 8, their dynamic between each other should feel noticeably different from
Yes.
the way it did in season 1,
Yep.
and
Yep.
it did not,
Oh,
unfortunately.
no. One thing that always bothered me that they do, and I've seen this is actually a really good example, because I see people kind of struggle with this in mid to large casts, where they have to have a moment where there is a character that's put on the spotlight because we need to know more about this character, kind of growing and whatever, having a moment, and they neglect the other characters. So during this whole time, they seem like cheerleaders in the background with no personalities, as the character that's the star of the episode or the chapter or whatever is kind of just, farting around and doing their thing. And, again, it's just like, these are great opportunities to have some kind of subtle growth and reactions and stuff like that. But it just, it always landed on silly little quips and nothing else, not even commenting on the main plot of what's going on, just kind of going with the flow, and really really dropping that. So in that sense, it really drops the fact that there's no actual motives with the characters or goals that you actually see. It just, it feels really, you know
A kind of way. There were a few moments. There were some moments in the show where it did seem like they were kind of aware of part of that was sort of lacking, like the the human characters' investment in the alien conflicts
yes.
and stuff. In the early seasons, there were a few moments where like they did kind of realize, like, we could go home now, or like, I want to go home even though this conflict isn't over. And it was it's definitely a good setup for like an arc, except it wasn't really handled as an arc. It was handled as a single episode
Yeah.
conflict where like they brought it up, and then there was a big fight, and then they decided, I guess I've got to stay out here with the rest of you guys after all. And then it was just kind of treated as a done deal. Like they're all totally okay with this now.
Yeah.
When maybe, what if one of them wasn't? It is kind of a big deal to like leave your home potentially for years or forever.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be totally understandable if some of these characters who are like kids were not okay with that. And it could have been interesting to kind of explore that like disconnect within the team. But because they needed to still be able to beat up the aliens in the next episode, it didn't really there wasn't really a chance to keep that through line.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly it. Like, keeping that conflict kind of like under the water, and then you kind of dip into it and you're like, "Oh no, that's still there. We're going to deal with it, and it's going to slowly be dealt with." And letting it pickle, like letting it stir in the characters' minds and being like, "Oh goodness, there's something to look forward to." And I want to see this confrontation with these two characters and in their, disagreements and stuff like that. But unfortunately, a lot of the times it was just really, really wrapped up at the absolute like really end of the episode. They didn't commit long enough to a narrative, and the conflict didn't last that long between the characters, between the plot, between anything. And when you don't have that, when you don't have characters who do question things, who do want to actually have conflict, it's hard to be invested in something like that, because
Mm-hmm.
when I know that everything's going to be okay at the end of the day, I'm not going to be surprised. I'm going to just be like, huh, should have just watched Paw Patrol. I don't know.
I don't necessarily mind when like, the episodes return to the status quo kind of at the end of each moment, but like it really depends on the kind of show that you're watching. And when I go into an epic sci-fi adventure, I feel like I expect there to be a bit more
Hmm.
push and pull against that. And when it comes to character writing especially, I feel like the thing that is like important even more so than like when it comes to planning a plot and whatnot is to really come at it from the inside out rather than
Yeah.
from the outside in, and like step back and look at things kind of through the eyes of the characters. Like, how do they see the situation that they're
Yes.
in? And are they actually okay with what's going on? Like, are they going to have like maybe a different thought about it than like the rest of their peers? And maybe their actual like motives or goals or like what they want out of this situation doesn't match up with the goal of the episode. But like if you lean into it a little, maybe you can end up with something more interesting than what you
Yes.
thought of at the beginning of the day.
Yes, exactly. It's just that conflict is what you need. Internal, external, whatever. You just need that little bit of conflict. So, at the end of the day, I do want to ask, we've talked about Voltron quite extensively.
Oh, have we ever?
What is your big takeaway from this journey that we've been on?
I guess the larger, the bigger picture thing that I think can kind of serve a lot of all storytellers kind of well is to think through character arcs
Hmm.
and kind of plot arcs, like in terms of a larger theme that you can kind of build towards. I feel like that can be kind of the gel that holds everything together. And a lot of my like quibbles with how the characters didn't have arcs and like how their actions didn't really support what I felt was supposed to be the surface level message of the
Yeah.
story. It never had a chance to become more than a surface level message because the writing didn't really invest itself in building towards that. Like it kind of paid lip service occasionally when the characters would be like, "We'll work together, we're a team," and stuff like that. But you can say that, but it won't feel that way unless that has been built towards
Hmm.
over the course of more than one scene.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely want to say that, committing to some kind of narrative or goal and stuff like that, and planning it out. I mean, it's very, very different with the way that Voltron has been made, obviously, with it being made by a studio, and you have your higher ups that
A lot of fingers in that pie.
yes, yes. So, this is not to be unfair to Voltron, because, again, it definitely had a lot of potential, and it's sad to see what had happened to some of the story things, to the point where in some episodes characters were calling it out against the show producers. Quite it was very there.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely planning out, you know, your story when you have something so big that like has so many arcs that are supposed to be in it, I think will really help you build with foreshadowing, have those moments that audiences can kind of latch on to, really anticipate, and, you know, just have a good time going through the show.
Yeah, and I feel like in other episodes we have talked about like not committing too early or too like fully to a specific outline, because you might
Mhm.
change it over time and like tweak things. But there's a certain point, there are some things that should, if not stay consistent, like you've got to try to find a way to make it seem like they were consistent. And those
Yes.
things are the tone and the theme of the story. And the little things like world building and stuff like that, you can retroactively make changes. And like my plot outlines, I'm constantly tweaking them as I go, because I'll just be like, I don't like this arc anymore, or like,
Mhm.
I'm just going to do something different here. But there is kind of a guiding tone and a voice to the story, and those things I try not to touch too much.
Yeah. Yeah. When something has a clear goal, you see it and you feel it, and you're just like, okay, this is going to be good, even if some of the things change along the way. And especially for webcomics, that's completely natural. That's very, very normal for them to change because they take so long to make, and we change as a person while we're making them. So maybe you were really, really into potentially having a very sexy vampire arc at one point, and then 5 years later you're like,
How did you know? Who told you? Where did you get these pictures of me?
So Thane took that out of Witchwood, and but it's okay when you know the goal of it, and you know it feels natural. It feels like, okay, regardless of whatever was supposed to happen, these characters still feel like they're reacting like they should because of how they were set up to be. The plot still feels relevant. It still feels thematic. I'm still in for the ride, and you know it makes sense.
And then the other important note is, when you make a big plot decision, you got to commit to the bit.
Yes.
Just like that phrasing.
It's a good phrase. Commit to the bit.
It's a good phrase.
Well, I think that that's quintessence. And I have been Krispy, and you can find my work at ghostjunksickness.com.
And I have been Thane, and you can find my work at tiralt.sevensmith.net or at witchwoodcomic.com.
I think that you should add the sexy vampire arc back into Witchwood. Thanks for listening to Screen Tones. Subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified of new episodes. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at ScreenTonesCast.